Hello and welcome to today's webinar on best practices for securing user accounts in Office 365. Today, what we're going to be doing is revealing what the top threats are in identity that we've seen in our experience and through our research, and what the best practices and solutions are for solving those issues. This is the first of three webinars focusing today on identity. So the first threat that we're going to focus on solving is that most data breaches today are caused when people use weak default or stolen passwords. One of the most common passwords is password 123. Most people actually recycle their passwords. So 70% of employees acknowledge of reusing maybe up to 4 passwords maximum across all websites that they use. That's a huge issue. The second issue is that people will be tricked eventually to click on phishing emails. It's almost impossible to prevent this from occurring. Even IT administrators are often tricked to clicking on phishing emails. In political campaigns especially, this is a big deal. Threat adversaries are out there trying to get into email systems for various motivations. And so we need to look at solutions that could help guard against this. So the first option in Office 365 is SMS or text messaging. So according to Microsoft, this will actually prevent 99% of account takeover. So it's very effective at, say, kind of casual or drive-by, bulk phishing kind of schemes. Nation-state actors, so advanced persistent threat actors, they actually have a fairly good success rate against this type of authentication. So there's several known techniques that they use to bypass this. SIM card swap, phone number porting, man-in-the-middle proxy attack, social engineering. Different methods can actually bypass this. So for this reason, the payment card industry, so if you're dealing with credit cards, they don't recommend using SMS for 2FA, nor does the Department of Commerce in the United States. Their National Institute of Standards and Technology is prohibiting SMS for 2FA. This is default in Office 365. So the Patriot recommendation is to actually go in and disable this. Basically, you just click on this link and you go into verification options and you uncheck these options like call to phone and text message. That's effectively how you would disable this kind of weaker form of MFA. Let's talk about another solution that folks often use, which is called IP fencing. This actually was probably one of the more common techniques of guarding networks in the past. It's kind of that castle moat, where you create this fence around, blocking IP addresses unless they originate from just your network, your trusted location. Then you kind of guard that location. So that would be considered an IP fence. I do see a lot of clients, especially in healthcare and government and DoD, using this method still. So there's some pros and cons here. But essentially, this would require remote users. They'd have to connect to a VPN in order to have their traffic originate from that trusted source. This particular method is not really to be confused with, blocking traffic from a particular country. What we're referring to when we say IP fencing, we're talking about a whitelist of authorized traffic from someone's internal network. When we see people blocking IP traffic from certain countries, this really is no longer very effective. Hackers just use Tor VPN or even launch a IaaS connection inside of your own country. So even though we do see people attempting to block, IPs based on, geographic region, not very effective. So just kind of keep that in mind. Some of the disadvantages of IP fencing, it's not effective for mobile devices unless you have an always-on VPN on that mobile device. Because every time you're, roaming on a 4G or 5G connection, you're, bound to get a different IP. So that's not going to work in that configuration. Not really the best user experience for users to always have to be connecting to VPNs. And it's not a zero trust principle. Since you're trusting your IP space, you should always assume breach. You should always assume that someone has breached your IP space and use other means to verify the user risk and the device risk. This also is not really practical for a 100% cloud environment. So especially if you're a political campaign or an organization that's gone 100% to the cloud, you're not really going to have a traditional IP fence anymore. So for these reasons, IP fencing is really kind of fallen out of favor. Third option, much stronger option, would be to use Authenticator application. So these actually use a secure token and they don't rely on SMS verification. So Microsoft Authenticator app is a great example of this. It's available on iOS and Android. There's also third-party Authenticator apps that you can use. The advantage of the Microsoft Authenticator app is it supports a feature called passwordless. And passwordless effectively means it eliminates the password, and you would actually instead use the Authenticator app to sign in. So this would become the first factor of authentication rather than the second factor. So that's something that the third-party apps do not yet support. The weakness is that all forms that I'm aware of user-based MFA are still susceptible to man-in-the-middle proxy attacks, where if a user clicks on a phishing link and they go through a proxy server, the proxy can actually grab and steal the authentication token issued from not just Microsoft, but really any IDP. So this is an issue with user-based authentication, which will lead us to talking about in a couple of slides, device-based authentication. But first, let's talk about hardware tokens. This is very, much more common in BYOD environments, and I should probably say it's particular fit for users who refuse to install apps on their personal phone. So sometimes we see this in union environments where they haven't really worked out an agreement for company apps or organization apps to be installed on personal phones. So what you can do here is you purchase these hardware tokens and issue them. There's no server infrastructure required. These work directly with Azure Active Directory. The weakness is again, they are still vulnerable to man-in-the-middle proxy attacks. We'll talk more about that later. Available from a few manufacturers, DeepNet, which is in England, Token 2, which is in Switzerland, and Ubico has a software authenticator app for OTP that's in the USA. So now we've talked about these man-in-the-middle attacks, and so let's talk about how we can actually guard against them. Device authentication. We're going to talk about two different options. The first option is using Intune enrollment. And so this would basically only allow a device to authenticate if it's a known corporate or personal device, and if it's healthy and compliant with your policies. So here's an example of a policy saying we want to make sure that Windows Defender Antivirus is up to date and installed, that there's encryption, firewall, BitLocker, and that there's no current risk on the device. In this particular case, the firewall has been disabled. This would fall out of compliance, and therefore you can actually block authentication to Office 365 until this is resolved. One of the best strengths of this approach is it is very effective against man-in-the-middle attacks, because that proxy server that stole the token, it's not enrolled into Intune, and therefore it can't replay that token because the conditional access would block this. This is also true zero trust, because we're not inherently trusting the IP address of a network, but we're trusting if the device is healthy and the user is healthy. Just keep in mind it does require Microsoft Intune licensing for this to work. So this is one of my highest recommendations I make to organizations that are really serious about security in Office 365. Again, the other methods we've talked about before have some significant limitations. The second option for device authentication is to verify domain join membership. So you can effectively block personal computers or machines that are not registered to your Active Directory environment. So that is one of the key dependencies. It does require traditional on-premise Active Directory for this option to work, and therefore Intune might be a better fit for you if you're 100% cloud environment. One of the benefits is this does not require an Intune license. So if you're traditional AD and you don't have Intune, this might be a great fit for you. A few other things to keep in mind: it's not available for Mac operating systems, and again, not available if you're 100% pure cloud environment. Okay, so we've kind of talked about this man-in-the-middle threat for a while. So let's kind of double click on this, go a little deeper here. So what is a man-in-the-middle? A man-in-the-middle is essentially a proxy server that a hacker sets up, and it's representing a landing page, whether it's Office 365 or Google Mail. Doesn't really matter what the landing page is, but the user will actually see the real sign-in page. It's not a fake page, it's the real page, but they're going through a proxy server in order to access that. So this particular piece of software is called EvilJinx. It's available on GitHub, so anyone can download this. It's publicly available code. And there's other software like it. It's not the only one that's out there. It just happens to be a favorite for hackers because it's very simple to set up. You don't need to know any programming or coding. It takes less than about an hour to get it up and running. The only thing they really need to do is to register a domain name and use a domain name for the phishing attack. So, something like Office365-MFA sign in or something like that. They send out a link and they're essentially able to capture the authentication token and then replay that as a cookie. So that's the threat of man in the middle. Now, one way that you can actually defeat this is actually to use FIDO2 security keys. They offer a feature called Universal 2FA. And UTF basically has a feature called origin binding. And what this means is that when the user goes to authenticate, when they click on a link, let's say they click on that fake, EvilJinx hyperlink, this will not authenticate against a fake website. It will only authenticate against the real website. So someone clicks on a fake link, they go to authenticate, the key checks the hyperlink against its trusted site, and if there's no match, then the user is saved from phishing links. So this is a very effective technique against phishing because users will, as we mentioned before, humans will be tricked, right? But this cryptography, it's going to check that hyperlink and verify it is the correct hyperlink. So this is a very strong form of anti-phishing. Now, today it's worth mentioning that this passwordless authentication option here for these FIDO2 keys cannot be forced as the only option for authentication. So technically a hacker who wants to get into someone's account can still target their other forms of 2FA that are available on their account because right now this is an optional configuration that a user would kind of opt in and choose to use on a go-forward basis. So they'll still be protected by the links they click on, but just keep in mind that this wouldn't keep an attacker out of the account if they target the backdoor kind of downgrade 2FA options available on the account.